My wife Lucy was scheduled to be with me, but she has been experiencing some health challenges more recently and declined to make the journey this time. We are looking at the end of the year going over to St. Vincent, taking my grandchildren, 3 of my grandchildren with us, and their parents. You know how that gets to be. The parents sort of come along because the grandparents want to be with the grandkids. But anyway, I was mentioning that to Pastor Vishnu today, and he's trying to hijack my trip to bring me here to Trinidad. I talked to Lucy about it this afternoon, and we'll certainly consider it. The welcome we've received, that I have received here, and that Dr. Santosh and Sheba Varghese have also, we've talked about you since we were here last. And there's a spirit of excellence here that is not the typical experience in the Caribbean. For example, things start on time. And, and your word is reliable. Basic things like that are threshold indicators of a more serious intent, more serious spirit. When I was here when I was here in July, you will recall that I did not hold back. I did not dumb anything down. I spoke to you as people who have the right and the expectation of hearing what God is saying in the earth today. And I intend to continue that same trajectory in our discussions. When I was a youngster, I grew up in a village in the north of St. Vincent. I was saying to Santosh today that God truly has a sense of humor, because he went to a village called Rosebank, which most of you have no reason to know such a place exists, to find this kid years and years ago, to develop someone who may speak a word in a season of time that is actually shifting and changing our understanding of who God is. I come back to the islands with a great sense of both privilege and humility, because I'm one of those who went much further in the world than you would expect someone of such obscure beginnings to have come to. This message of sonship is one of the key assets upon which I have relied on my journey. There's nothing that can take from you or diminish the importance of an identity as a son of God. It's a permanent identity. It's a portable identity. So wherever you go, it goes with you. It is not time specific. It is not place specific. It's not even relationally specific. It is separate and apart from every other influence that might define you differently. So I'm a son of God whether I'm in the Philippines or anywhere in Europe. And when I walk amongst, as I often do, leaders of various stripes, my sonship does not allow me to be intimidated by anybody. Because as a son of God, no one has anything that can be used to influence you negatively, because you know who you are. So, if you had a particularly cunning enemy who knows the power of an identity as steadfast, as unmovable, as non-negotiable as being a son of God, what do you suppose he would attack? Well, don't take my word for it. When the Son of God was in the wilderness and the devil came to attack him, what was the temptation? How did he begin? If you are the Son of God. You think that's accidental? That's a very precise targeting in the hope of accomplishing maximum results. And he didn't just stop there. He took him to the pinnacle of the temple and said, if you are the Son of God, cast yourself down, for it is written, he will give his angels charge over you, and they'll bear you up lest you should dash your foot against a stone. And he didn't stop at that. The third try was, I'm going to place your sonship in jeopardy by offering you a deal you can't refuse. If you will fall down and worship me, I'll give you the kingdoms of the world because I constructed them. And you've come to save mankind. Save them all you want. But first you must bow down and worship me. Because he understood, as this cunning entity understands, he understood that if he bowed and worshiped, then it didn't matter what Satan gave him, because he could only hold it as a vassal. He could only hold it because Satan allows him. It's the quintessence of subterfuge. What that means in plain language, if you boil it all down to its barest essence, the quintessence of deception, of trickery. Because if you give anybody something and they accept the terms and conditions upon which the thing is given, they're always going to be tethered to your goodwill. You can never move independent of their say-so. So he's offering nothing and hoping to gain everything. And Jesus, whose orientation was and remained that of being the Son of God, what did he tell him? He said, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. He put him in his place. You are the creature. I am the Lord your God, your maker. Now get in your place. Listen, we may read the scriptures and memorize scripture, but if we don't have understanding of what we're reading, then it's almost as if we don't know what we've read. When I was a boy up in this little village called Rosebank, I had some relatives who came back from Aruba. And among their possessions, and something that ended up in my hands, was a child's Bible. And I remember one summer, I sat and I read the whole thing. I must have been 8 or 9 years old. I came across the story of how Solomon arbitrated the matter of whose child it was. You remember the story with the two women claiming this child? And as I was reading the story, it occurred to me that the king knew that the method he was using would flesh out the true nature of the mother versus the claimant. It just occurred to me, an 8-year-old boy, that he knew if he put it that way, we'll cut the baby in two. King knew that if you'd put it that way, the true mother would rather save the life of the child than get to raise it. Don't ask me how I knew, I just knew. And I remembered at about the age of 7 or 8, I couldn't have been any older than that, I thought, if I could have that, I would choose that over everything else. That being what I didn't even know the word wisdom existed. I just knew, I got inside his head and knew. And I remember grinning broadly when it worked out. So from the age of about 8, still in that little village, northern part of St. Vincent, I started praying. Every time I prayed, which was every day and sometimes multiple times a day, I began to ask God for wisdom. Now, about 25 years or so ago, and by the way, I'm 73. I racked up another year since I saw you, believe it or not. Thank you. So, about 25 years or so ago, one night I was praying. And the Lord said to me, I have given you wisdom. Because you asked, I've given you wisdom. And I'll keep on giving you wisdom. But now, I want you to pray for understanding. Now, I thought wisdom and understanding were one and the same thing. But heaven opened to me. And I began to understand what I was reading. It was sometime after I had been baptized in the Spirit. So now every time I read the scriptures, my searching out is for understanding. There are 3 major things to seek from God. Number 1 is knowledge. Number 2 is understanding. And number 3 is wisdom. So knowledge is the what. What is it? What is it you're looking at? Understanding is why. Why is it so? And wisdom is how. What do I do with this? Now I know that this These are not my 3 points, by the way. These are not my 3 points of the message. I'm just laying a foundation for you. Otherwise, when we read the scriptures, it's a lot of information with no place to go. We don't know what to do with it. So we'll know the what, but we'll know neither the why nor the how. And if you don't, then you find yourself impressed by people who can tell you what the what is, but neither they nor you would be able to understand why is it so. And it's in the understanding of why it is so that you have access to the very thoughts of God. I remember I was speaking in a conference, I think it was in Johannesburg some years back, and I read the scriptures. I was aware of these things, and I was wanting to open this discussion with the audience I was speaking to at the time. So I read the first verses, or the first words of Genesis 1, in which it says, as you know, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I paused there long enough for them to think I was having a senior moment. And when they were duly uncomfortable with it, and I knew I had their attention, I said, why? And you could see the confusion on the faces of the audience. Who are you to ask after, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth? Why? Who are you to ask that? Does God need to give you an account? Can he not, as God, do whatever he wants to? I intended to provoke them to think. Because if God created as the scriptures plainly said he did, and indeed as he did, if God created the heavens and the earth, there was a reason that already existed in the mind of God for the necessity of those things. And in creating them, he's simply setting the stage for what he's about to do. But all of that is before he did anything. He's doing to facilitate that which he already knows. So, what then exactly was God doing when he created the heavens and the earth? What was he doing? Why? Well, it's in the later part where it says, and on the 6th day, God said, let us make man in our own image, after our own likeness, and let him have dominion over, in summary, all of the creation we have created. God said, let us make man in our image after our own likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps along the earth. And it was so. A man in our image after our own likeness. Now, the easy saying is that that was Adam. And indeed it was. But there are two Adams. The first Adam and, not the second, the last Adam. The first Adam brought death, but the last Adam is a life-giving spirit. So when God said, let us make man in our image and likeness, he was not speaking primarily of the first Adam, because it is impossible for God to not know the end of every matter from the beginning. It's impossible. Time doesn't define God. God created time to serve purposes pre-existent in God. So time is contained in God like space. He holds everything in the breath of his hand, and time is the servant of the interests of God. So then, when a matter is known, the end from the beginning, there is a progression until that which was spoken of before now becomes the reality. So a man in the image and likeness of God is a particular kind of man. Image would suggest that he's of the same kind and nature as God himself. I want to show you something, if I can, from the book of Hebrews, chapter 1. Just in case some of you are thinking, well, he's just so intellectual. No, I challenge people to think. I challenge the saints to mature, to become what they were designed to be. Because that's the irritating or agitating nature of apostles. St. Vincent has its own vocabulary. It's a subdialect of the rest of the Caribbean. I bet you probably don't know the word avaricious. That's a Vincentian word. He's so avaricious. Means he's a provocateur. Means he provokes people. He's avaricious. Now, sometimes being avaricious is also obnoxious. But sometimes being avaricious is a useful thing because it disturbs the settled views. I don't lay claim to being avaricious, by the way. Because it's a word that has a variety of potential usages, and I would not wish to be associated with most of those usages. But I am one who's given to provoke. That's actually a biblical word, not avaricious, but provoke. To provoke one another to love and good works. Now, here, from the book of Hebrews, we're talking about a man in the image and likeness of God. I'm really after something tonight. I want to talk to you about the culture of the orphan. But before you can understand the culture of the orphan, you must understand what I choose to call God's original intent. What did God intend when he created man? Because if you understand the comparison, then you can choose. If you understand the comparison between an orphan and a son, then you may choose. And you may choose with the expectation that if God is restoring his original intent, then he intends to empower it as well. So it's not really up to us, except in the matter of choice. But you really cannot choose if you don't know what the options for choice are. So I'm taking you back. We started this, in July of last year. We started down this path. And I think that it was more like one of these television series that it kind of got cut off. So here we are again, series 2, or season 2. So here, a man in the image and likeness of God. I was saying to you that such a man had to be a spiritual man, that God was looking all the way past Adam to Christ. Because Christ fits the description of a man in the image and likeness of God. And such a man, being spiritual, was intentionally given into the earth to collect those who would respond to this message and assemble them in his person and present them to God as the existent person of Christ in heaven and on earth, as is said in the book of Ephesians, as you know. Ephesians chapter 3 says, the whole family of God in heaven and on earth derives its name from the person of Christ. Look, if you could ever deny a person his true identity, you can capture that person. It's exactly what Satan came to do with Jesus. If you are the Son of God, if you are the Son of God, here, fall down and worship me, put yourself, okay, we've established maybe you are the Son of God, but now the test is, will you put yourself under me for these rewards? And Jesus said, you still are a creature. I am your God. You will worship me. If we are in Christ, this is both our state and our estate. But let me close the gap here on showing you that we really are talking about Christ when God said, let us make man in our image and likeness. Look, Hebrews 1 says, God who at various times, King James would say, God who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in times past to the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us, or to us, by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the worlds, who, being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, that's image and likeness, the brightness of his glory and the expression of the very personhood of God. That's Christ. Now, Ephesians 1 will tell us that God put everything under the rulership of Christ and made him to be head over all things for the church, which is his body. So whenever God is speaking of the man in the image and likeness of God, God is speaking of the person of Christ to include the many members of his body. That's why we are joint heirs with him. That's why we are partakers of the divine nature. That's why. That's why. Can you hear it? That's why. That's the spirit of understanding. When you understand, then your feet are firmly planted in what is actually true. And there's nothing in creation, not Satan, not the constructs of the cosmos, not any appeal of any kind can shake that reality. And your singular task is simply to believe that these things are so. It's been several decades now. There was a movie, it was a television movie. The name of it was Roots. You probably remember that movie. The world stopped when the movie Roots was played. And one of the most harrowing of the scenes was this young African who had been abducted from his homeland and transported across the Atlantic to North America, was enslaved, sold into slavery, and he kept trying to run away because he had an identity of being a free man before he understood that before he was made into a slave. And he kept running away and running away and running away. And every time they would beat him savagely and tell him that his name was not Kunta Kinte, his name was Toby, his slave name. And he'd run away and they'd catch him and bring him back and beat him. And then finally, they chopped one of the blades of one of his feet. They chopped it off, chopped it in two. Only way to prevent Kunta Kinte from running away. And then they beat him and asked him, "What is your name?" And when he whispered the word Toby, we all fell emotionally into the slavery into which we knew he had then fallen. You may imprison a person, you may beat a person, but if you do not strip them of their identity, you can never make a slave out of them. But if you strip them of their identity, they're already your possession. This is not a new scheme. He came into the garden to challenge the relationship between God and his sons, Adam and Eve. How do we know they were the sons of God? Let me show you. Let me show you. And then I want to build out then the message of the culture of the orphan. Go back to Genesis. Now, at the end of chapter 1 of the book of Genesis, when God creates man, we see the glory of what he gives them. Be fruitful and multiply. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, fowl of the air," and so on. And it was so. God saw everything that he had done, and it was very good. Now, then the serpent comes into the garden. And by the way, at the end of chapter 2 of the book of Genesis, here's an interesting thing. It's how the man viewed his wife before the fall. This is just an interesting aside. When Adam was awakened out of his sleep, Adam said, "This is now flesh of my," he's speaking of the woman, "flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones, she shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed. Now, you go over to chapter 3, and the serpent comes into the garden. And look at how he comes. First thing, he targets the woman. Why? Because she was supposed to be under the covering of the man. How do we know that? Because when it's restored, that's how it looks. Christ and the church. Remember that from Ephesians. Behold, I show you a mystery. But I'm speaking about Christ and the church. It says, husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church, gave himself up for it, and so on. And the requirement to the husband is that he loves his wife to the point of laying down his life. It does not require the wife to lay down her life for the husband. Because the church does not have to lay down its life for Christ. Because Christ is the one who demonstrates the love of God the Father, which holds the whole thing together. Now, I'm ahead of myself because the culture of the orphan is what we're about to see. And I'm giving you an example of it as we lead up to talking about the culture of the orphan. So God comes, end of chapter 3, the book of Genesis. They're now out. They've out of the garden. They've made themselves clothes of fig leaves and they're hiding. And they heard the sound, verse 8 of Genesis 3. They heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord among the trees of the garden. Then the Lord God called to Adam and said, I know you know this story, okay? I mean, I know you are aware of this story, but we're going to look at it with new eyes in the next little while, all right? Then the Lord God called to Adam and said, where are you? Verse 10. So he said, I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. And he said, who told you you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree which I commanded you, that you should not eat? Now, this is the first evidence of the culture of an orphan replacing the culture of a son. The man said, the woman you gave me. Now, what did he say before? He awakes, he sees this gorgeous creature, and what does he say? Flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones. I'm going to name you, because that's one skill he had. He had been naming things. You shall be called woman. You're like me. You're like kind to me, because you were taken out of me. And God said, yes, yes. And for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother. So God's projecting this matter down through the history of mankind. Because until then, it was just him and her. So, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Now, let me add one thing to that from the book of Ephesians. This is a profound mystery, but I am speaking about Christ and the church. It's this, and they're bookends of the same thing. One is the natural, the other is the spiritual. And the man whose side had been cut open by God, from which the rib was removed, to make the woman, about whom he exclaimed, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones. That's why he was saying that, because she was made out of the rib taken out of his side. Another man would have his side pierced to open a new and living way through the veil, that is to say, his flesh. Because if you can take the wife out of the man, you can reinsert her. One is natural, the other is spiritual. Nicodemus had a problem with the reinsertion. How can a man be born again when he's old? Can he enter a second time into his mother? And Jesus said, no. That which is born of flesh is, and that which is born of spirit is spirit. Now, this is the spirit of understanding. We should, when we view the scriptures, it should flow out of us like a river of divine understanding, and you can't be deceived when that's the case, because you have all the templates and the plumb line so you can judge yourself and correct yourself. But that's what the mature does. That's what the mature does. When God made this first man, then, and he fell from that estate, the first thing he lost, and the first indication of an orphan, it's all about him. The orphan will throw even his own flesh and blood and bone under the bus. Now, is it any surprise? Is it any surprise at all that women don't trust men? It all started here. And if we cannot build on this foundation, truly we have nothing upon which we can build. And we're trying to build with material that is not substantial. That's what happens when you build a house on sand. Time will test it. How did Jesus end the Sermon on the Mount? If you hear these sayings of mine and you do them, you're like a wise man who essentially builds on me, builds his house upon the rock of ages, the principles we're talking about. And the foolish man will throw away real value. Can you imagine the idiocy of men who... Now, I understand that there's a whole other side to this, okay? But here's where this side we're going down started. The idiocy of a man who will live with a wife a lifetime, have children and grandchildren together, and decide that some image on the internet is to be preferred over a faithful wife of a lifetime. Something's got to be wrong with you. I'm not going to do too much more with that, because this is not actually a seminar on marriage. It's really one of the first indications, you see, of the culture of the orphan. Now, is it any surprise that when a man takes the position that it is him and his interests above all else, is it any surprise at all that within one generation, one of his sons will murder the other? Or have we not connected the dots? Why do you think Cain killed Abel? because his father had departed. Adam had already departed from his father, and there was no sense of the continuity of the generations. I was telling Pastor Vishnu a story about teaching my children how to rule. And I'll save the story itself for a later time. But there's an incident when my daughter Tamarind, who's the older, as between her and her brother Nicholas, when they were just youngsters running around the house, Nick would be, Tamarind might have said something insulting to Nick, as siblings do. Siblings routinely do that. And Nick's head would fall on, his chin would fall on his chest, and he was moping around, bouncing around the house. And I might have caught him in that mood, and I would say to him, "Nicholas, what's the problem?" And he would say, "Nothing." I said, "No, you're in the house, you're in your room. You should be outside playing. Something has to be wrong. Now tell me what's wrong." Well, Tamarind called me a cuckoo head. I don't know what a cuckoo head is. I don't know what a cuckoo head is to this day. But it was the worst thing that Tamarind could have said to Nicholas. "You're a cuckoo head." So I asked him, I said, "Well, Nicholas, are you in fact a cuckoo head?" He said, "No." Then I said, "Well, Tamarind hasn't spoken what's true, has she?" "No." Next thing I know, I overhear him having this throwdown with Tamarind, having this conversation with Tamarind. And the way what I said comes out to her, through him, is, "Dad said you're a liar." Sibling rivalry is a fact of life. And if unchecked, it'll run to the extreme of where one will kill the other. We have the example of Cain and Abel. What actually restrains? What assigns value in the mind of a sibling? Because we're talking about Cain and Abel and the culture that ensued when Adam departed from his father. What restrains a sibling from murderous thoughts and, when left unchecked and running to the extreme, actual murder of brothers, a brother against a brother? What actually restrains them? When I spoke to both of them, they saw in what I said that I valued each of them. So well before they're inclined to treat each other kindly, they're instructed that the other has value because the Father says they have value. And they know the loving kindness of the Father toward them. And if he feels the same way toward the other, then it restrains them. The orphan culture, by definition, is the rejection of the restraint of the Father. By definition, you may use the terms orphan and fatherless interchangeably. And the net effect is there's never the deep seating of the recognition of value in another if you don't have a father to convey that to you. It's where you learn it when you don't want to learn it. It's where you learn it when when your sister calls you a cuckoo head. And you're thinking thoughts you shouldn't be thinking about what her comeuppance needs to be. It restrains because you understand, my father loves me. And I don't know how he can do it, but he loves her as well. So, because I am under the restraint of my father, I must at least restrain myself in regards to how I view my sister until I find out what he knows about her that might be valuable. And for the life of me, I can't tell you what might be valuable about her now, because all I know is I'm a cuckoo head to her. And for that matter, well, maybe she needs to be a cuckoo head to me. That spirit unchecked formed in Cain the resentment of such force and power that when God accepted the sacrifice of his brother and rejected his, the only thought in his mind was, I'm going to kill the competition, to use a good business term. In fact, in business, the language is, kill the competition. Because what you do when you're an orphan is you understand that you are the only resource you have upon which you may rely. And if somebody threatens that resource, they're threatening you. If that somebody happens to be a brother or a sister, actually a flesh and blood brother or sister, you have no basis for valuing them. So you devalue them in word and deed. So, point number 2. Point number 1 is the man who is an orphan in his thinking will throw flesh of his flesh, bone of his bones under the bus. Same mouth said both of those things. He woke up, there was this gorgeous creature, and he was overwhelmed with the emotion of the moment. Flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones, she shall be called woman, taken out of man. And God said, yes, in fact, my destiny for you is that you be one so that you may represent Christ in the church. Scene changes, God calls them to account. I don't know the woman. You and I were having such a wonderful time when it was just you and me, God. And it wasn't my idea for you to create her because I was asleep. That cannot be stretched far enough to encompass consent. I was asleep. Was not my idea. And he rejects his own flesh and blood. That's why there's language to this effect in Ephesians. For no man ever yet hateth his own flesh, but loves and cares for it just as Christ does the church. So there's a searing of the conscience. Part of the mindset change when Adam changed from being a son to an orphan was his conscience was seared. Because by his own declaration, he said, this is mine. This has been taken from me. Flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones. And it goes from that to the woman you gave me. She's the cause of our problem. He wants to make it God and his problem. He wants to bring God back in, as if God has to agree with him. You and I were having just a wonderful time. And then you thought to give me something I never asked you for. So really, when you get right down to it, it has to be your fault. That's how an orphan looks. Look, I'm not making up the narrative, you know. I'm not even embellishing it. I'm using their own words. Before and after. What does that tell you? It tells you that there was a substantial mindset change. There was a substantial mindset change. Now, if you're born into that mindset, then you don't even remember what it was supposed to have been. And you have to be recultured to it. When slavery ran through these islands, the population that derived from the descendants of slaves were primarily severed from any identity, anything resembling being a son of God, or anybody's son. We know the harrowing stories of slavery in which families were summarily torn apart and family members sold in different directions. Do you know why the number one problem facing Trinidad and Tobago today are these gangs of hopeless youth? You know why? Because of the culture of fatherlessness, which is the metastasized legacy of slavery. So even though the incidences of slavery are actually now historic, and we live in nations that have their own constitution, governed by people who look like each other and not by white overlords, and this isn't about white and black. New masters arise with the same mindset, and the beat goes on. But God said, in the last days, because this will be the condition in the last days, I am going to turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and I'll restore the hearts of the children to their fathers. It's too late for this to happen naturally. It can only happen spiritually. That's why we're restoring the understanding of what it actually means to be a man in the image and likeness of Christ, because the solution lies in the body of Christ. A spiritual man who may ennoble natural men by the example of divine restitution. And this is the message today, because the whole earth is groaning under the curse of the culture of the orphan. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the culture of the orphan. So we've identified two things that are seminal. The mindset of an orphan will always contain the me first approach, even if it involves someone as close and dear as a wife. flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones. Now, I'm understanding that in presenting it from this angle, it seems to be a focus on the culture of the orphan as it simply involves men. By no means is that the case. Whoever possesses the culture of me first, me above everything else, is fully enfranchised in the culture of the orphan, male or female. It's just easier to show you the pristine nature of the curse by following the storyline of the history of how we got here. The second of these things that really go with it, but it's a depravity that was not evidenced in the original first draft of this story. It's between Adam and Eve. By the time it reaches the next generation, the effects are amplified. Now the brother will murder the brother because the brother has no connection emotionally to the other. Because the father left his father, lost his identity in the process, and has none to impart to his sons. Who was Adam, the first Adam? How do scriptures define the first Adam? Here, let's look at the genealogy of Christ from the book of Matthew. From the book of Luke. Matthew gives the partial genealogy. Luke gives the complete genealogy. I think it's Luke 3. Luke chapter 3. And it says, verse 23, "Now Jesus himself began his ministry at about 30 years of age, being, as was supposed, the son of Joseph, the son of Heli, the son of Matthat, the son of Levi, the son of Melchi, the son of Jonah, the son of Joseph, the son of Matthiah, the son of Amos, the son of Nahum, the son of Esli, the son of Nagai, son of Matthat." I've run out of breath. The son of the son of Maeliel, the son of Cainan, the son of Enosh, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, the son of God. That's Luke 3:38. The son of Enosh, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, the son of God. You know, that's why this genealogy was written, to show us that the original son was the son of God, Adam. What does that make 62 generations later? Son of God. Now there's a 63rd generation. It's ageless, it's timeless. Because that's when it transitioned from the natural to the spiritual. And you were included in Christ. So we are the 63rd generation from Adam in this genealogy. And that allows us to claim we are the sons of God. You know, all this stuff was there all along. We just didn't have understanding. We just didn't have understanding. But the times for understanding have come. All right. Let me draw out some more intrusive conclusions from this story of Adam. You know, we haven't really left the book of Genesis. We haven't got past Genesis 3 to rediscover what the original offense resulted in. So, what did they do after they ate of the tree? Satan came, he said, you shall not surely die. God knows if you eat of it, your eyes will be opened. You'll know good and evil. You will live forever. You shall not surely die. And they saw that the fruit of the tree was pleasing to the eye, desirable to make them wise, so they ate. The woman ate, gave to her husband with her. In other words, he was right there all along. It wasn't like he was off tending to the garden. Look what it says. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and it was pleasant to the eyes, and the tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave to her husband with her. Did you see that? These are powerful little words. With. You know what that means? He was right there. Within hand reach. Here, have some of this. And he ate. That wasn't supposed to be his role. He was supposed to get in front of her and between her and the devil. He was supposed to have said, "You're not going to talk to my woman. This ain't going to happen." Assuming, Adam spoke with the accent of an African American. He should have inserted himself between her and the serpent, because that was his role. That's what it means to be under somebody. You have no business being under someone who will not protect you. That's why so many exploiters of the body of Christ get away with it for so long. They're not in the image and likeness of Christ. They take advantage of the people. The devil doesn't even have much of a chance to tempt the people. They're taking advantage ahead of the time when the enemy could take advantage. But that, I'm announcing to you that is now time to change. It is now the time for that to change. A people who have come to know their God are not going to put up with this any longer. They're not going to. They're going to insist on the accuracy of this plumb line as the basis of judging all things. They're going to rediscover. Look, you can do that to an orphan because the imperative of the orphan is to survive. And if survival is ahead of every other consideration, then the orphan will concede even his most basic principles in order to survive. A son will not do that. What did Jesus do when he was confronting Satan? And the question was, are you the Son of God? Did he concede? No, because he knew that his resource is his Father. That was what was lost. His economy was lost. So not only was his wife lost, not only were his generations lost, but his economy was lost. So you say, well, talk to me a little bit more about his economy being lost. The two basic things that constitute an economy, what we look for in an economy, are the two conditions of what protects us, and what supplies us. So if we could just put labels on things, provision and protection are the two most basic human needs. If you look at Adam and Eve, before the fall, who protected them? God. They were not even aware of a need to be protected. The protection of God was so sovereign. Satan was already around by then. He had just not made it into their garden. So God protected them so thoroughly that their existence was one of rest. How were they provided for? Who fed them? You notice when Satan came into the garden, you notice his approach. He said basically, is there anything to eat around here? Meaning, the way he framed the question cast doubt on God's provision. He said, can you eat of any tree in this garden? And Eve's answer was, we can eat of every tree in the garden. You see the difference? Her response spoke to the abundance. We can eat of every tree. Satan's question sought to limit that to, is there a tree around here that we can eat from? The orphan thinks in terms of scarcity and lack. The orphan lives in a perpetual fear of not having enough. Why? Because the only resource that an orphan has is himself. In America, a recession-proof economy is one business model that is generally viewed as recession-proof, meaning doesn't matter what's going on in the rest of the economy, this will make money. You know, like the funeral industry, that will make money no matter what is going on, because people die. The other is storage units. I don't know if you have those here. Storage units. That's where people with all this excess stuff that they never use hire storage units in which to put them just in case. Just in case. Just in case of what? I mean, some people will have the wheel from a wheelbarrow. You know, the wheelbarrow has been worn out, but they'll keep the wheel. And you say, what in the world are you thinking? Oh, just in case. Just in case what? You need to build a whole new wheelbarrow so you can put this wheel on? It's the anticipation of lack. I know people who have 3 storage units, but stuff they haven't even looked into in years, paying $100 and some a month every month for stuff that if you burned it up, they wouldn't miss it. And if you brought it out, you'd be repulsed by what it looks like. But the culture of the orphan is the culture of a hoarder. The culture of the orphan is the culture of a hoarder. You haven't worn that item in 3 years, but you're still holding on to it, just in case. Why? Because the fact that you have control of it gives you comfort that if you were to need it, you'll have it. This thing is more than just what meets the eye. It's so subtle, it seeps into your very bones. Now, they don't just do it with stuff, they do it with money. What I mean is, people will say, I can't afford to tithe. A worse business decision I can't imagine. Because what they're saying is, I can't give God his portion, I am too poor. I don't trust God. Now, this isn't about tithing, I'm just using examples. If you ever hear me trying to take an offering, don't ever have me back, because I've fallen from grace. The living God knows how to supply the economy of his kingdom exceedingly abundantly, more than you could even think or ask. And a true father, when you're restored to the state of being a son, a true father will be the resource that the sons need in order to be leveraged up to the places where they need to be. Let me give you an illustration. And it cuts directly across the path of the culture of orphans. When my children were in high school, the same two, Nick and Tamron, they didn't stay at the stage of cuckoo heads, as you might well imagine. They were old enough where I needed to begin to teach them how to rule. Because if you don't teach them how to rule, you'll teach them how to be a consumer and never a supplier. Never a distributor. God's house and the sons of God are distributors of grace. They're not mere consumers. And if you don't teach children how to rule, you'll teach them to be dependent on the rule of another. Now, rule is not what it sounds like. When Adam was put in the earth, what did God say to him? Have dominion. The word from which dominion is derived, dominus, domini, is the word for Lord. In Spanish, it's the word domingo, or Sunday, the day of the Lord. It's where we get the idea of the ruler. Lord is ruler. God said to Adam, have dominion, rule. Over what was he given dominion? The whole earth. Rule it. It is intrinsic to the status of being a son to also be a ruler. But orphans, whenever they rule, when an orphan rules, everybody under his rule is oppressed. Because the orphan sees rule as merely the opportunity for him to plunder everybody. Why? Because he's his only resource. An orphan has no other resource. So if you give the orphan the slightest bit of power, he will turn that into a basis for his support. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about politicians or preachers and everything in between. You can tell the culture of the orphan by what they do with power. You give the orphan, you make him dog catcher. And you try to find a way to monetize that. Learning to rule is not simply a matter of hearing about ruling. It is actually being shown how to rule. So I taught my children how to rule. Now, I don't know if you have what I'm about to explain. I don't know if you have a type of that here in Trinidad. But in high schools in the U.S., I'm on the second cup, by the way, so it means that it'll begin to wind down anytime now, if you're lucky. They have something called marching band, okay? And it's where, there's a drum major and they get out in front of the band and it's a very detailed process. Both of my children, both of those two children were drum majors at their high schools. And sometimes they had to call meetings with the heads of the different sections of the band to discuss and coordinate the program. And so they would go off campus to restaurants like McDonald's, Pizza Hut, those things, that were right off campus. In fact, in most American high schools, you will find these fast food restaurants just across the street, so the kids could walk across the street if they didn't want to eat the food in the cafeterias. So from time to time, first Tamarind and then Nicholas were the drum majors, and they would call meetings of their section leaders and go to restaurants across the street. And I told them, I said, now, when you call a meeting, I was teaching them how to rule. I'm illustrating how that works. I said, when you call a meeting and your section leaders meet with you over at a restaurant, if you notice any of the students just sitting there drinking water and telling you they're not hungry, when the rest of you are eating sandwiches and pizza and so on, then go over to them quietly. Do not embarrass them. Go over to them quietly and say to them, I am buying your lunch today. And I'm giving you enough money in your allowances because I know you have increased responsibilities. So you take care of the people under your rule. When you call the meeting, do not allow any member of your team to be embarrassed because they don't have enough money to eat lunch. It's your responsibility. I started there with them because I knew that all around them was the mindset of people who operated out of a sense of lack. And I wasn't raising consumers. I was raising rulers. The first order of rule, when you use the word rule, which is the culture of the son, not the culture of the orphan, the first order of rule is the well-being of those who are subject to your rule. First order of rule is their well-being. And it takes on a myriad of forms. I'll tell you about another one, and this one is less charitable to me than that example. So God began to show me that my responsibility to rule righteously in regards to my wife was in serious need of upgrade, which is to say, I wasn't even close to knowing how to be a good husband, how to be the husband like Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. You see, you don't get it by osmosis. You have to be taught. And to teach it, you have to be under the rule of a father who can impart to you, like Paul to Timothy, the things you learn from me among many witnesses, commit to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. And here I'm reaching into the archives of my personal stories, because I'm laboring that Christ may be formed in you. Lest you think I was always at this place, I want to be sure to disabuse you of that notion, and more to the point, I want to give you some indication of what the journey looked like at various snapshot points in that journey. And one of them was when God was showing me how poorly I ruled in regards to my wife. Now, I thought I was, good as any man, and I probably was, but that didn't say much for the men. So, my wife has a gift. Her mother before her had it, a gift to decorate a home. And even when we didn't have very much money, she brought that gift and would place the furnishings we had in just a very refined way in the house. Well, the Lord was working on me in upgrading my rule in the house. And he showed me the revelation. I remember I was in a place called Boise, Idaho, when he gave me the revelation of the role of a woman. The role of a woman is to teach the man how to be a bride to Christ, because men do not naturally know how to be brides. And the way in which the wife submits to the husband is actually what instructs him in how he ought to submit as the bride of Christ. Right? When it says, and so also with Christ, he's talking about men and women as the bride submitting to the rulership of the husband. And it was that point where he gave me all these downloads to include that I was not modeling Christ to my wife, but all the while thinking I was a pretty good husband. And indeed, I think I was a pretty good husband. But that wasn't saying much for me or the genre of husbands. And God meant to upgrade me. You see, I've been at this a long time. And I've had opportunity to hear from God and to put it into practice. So I may be new to you, but I'm not new to these things. And God has been showing me for decades, in pure obscurity, how to engage the principles of Scripture, the why behind the what. Because he's restoring the culture of sons, taking it back from the culture of orphans. And orphans' culture is the default setting of everybody except the sons of God, who are now being recultured to it. The gospel is designed to operate within a certain context. And if that context is missing, whatever comes out is not the gospel. How do we know that? Because the same devil that said, if you are the Son of God, is still trying to hold the sons of God in bondage, even when they are the sons of God. So this is not a default setting. You can't just cruise into this. This is an active engagement in a warfare to take back the identity of sons so that they may fulfill the purposes for which God had sons in the first place. Yeah. If you want to call this a revival, then let it be a revival of this kind. Not just people strutting around and shouting at you. So I wasn't so good as a husband. And the Lord was showing me how deficient I was in the matter of my rule over my wife. Now, by now you understand, I probably mean something different when I use the word rule than you would normally say or attribute to the term rule. But I'm not dumbing it down and I'm not backing off, because have dominion means have dominion. And dominion is to achieve a certain result. And if you call it anything else, and if you practice any other thing, that result is not to be achieved. Rule is to bring forth the glory of God in every situation. I'll say it again, it bears repeating. Rule is the bringing forth of the glory of God in every situation. And I was the shadow in the situation that I'm about to reveal to you. So I came home from Idaho, where I was in a meeting, and I was so full of this revelation, this insight, that I said to Lucy, I said, you have my permission to decorate this house in any manner that you would choose. Now, background was, it's a simple thing. You know, I'm taking spiritual truths and putting them in context of natural things, like a home and decoration of a home. You may put it in any context, because it'll change the context, because it allows for the glory of God to be ported into that context. And what is true is, if the glory of God is carried, is invited into any context, it comes with its own economy. Because God is more interested in the display of His glory through us into our circumstances than we will ever be. Because it's His glory. Now, so I came home and I said, I've been fighting you over the decorating of this house. So the first thing I want to recognize is you have a domain that operates under my authority, but I have been blocking you from giving your gift. So my rule has hindered you from being who you're supposed to be. And I said, so decorate the house however you want to. Well, I grew up in these islands and had very much a British sensibility, which included old mahogany furniture, Duncan Fife, tables with 4 layers of varnish, that had now run some places. We call those things antiques. Lucy, on the other hand, had family in California and grew up in the light, airy, decorating style of California. And you could tell it. You could tell the discord, the lack of harmony between us just walking into our house. Here was the whole Duncan Fife set. The table, the dining table, you could put leaves in it and all these chairs and a place to put china and a buffet, and in the next room was a white couch or beige couch that was totally California. So just walking through our house, you would say, I have a word for this house. Roses are red, violets are blue, I'm schizophrenic, and so am I. Because the different personalities, no harmony in the way the thing looked. Now, we were young, so that was perhaps an excuse of sorts. But you could also tell we were young and foolish. So I said to her, decorate the house however you choose. She looked at me, and I think she wondered, well, I don't understand why he's being nice to me. I bet you he's up to something. But she let it pass. She said, really? I said, really? So I had to go out of town shortly after that. I came back, and there was not one stick of my furniture in the house. It was gone. It's like I had a visitation from aliens who loved my furniture and took it all with them into outer space. Not one thing I recognize. And oh, how I regretted that moment in which I thought I heard God. Because my stuff was gone. I said, now, you choke back your real feelings and you say, well, what arrangement did you make for the furnishings that I liked? She said, oh, I had a consignment shop come the day you left. They hauled everything away. And in those days I said, you're selling them? How much do you think we'll get for them? And she said, I don't care. I never want to see them again. And from that date to this, I've never asked her what she wants to do with the house. Sometimes she'll ask me, I'm thinking of doing this or that. And while I'm speaking to her, she will say, no, I don't think that'll work at all. So then I'll say, well, it puzzles me as to what exactly was your interest in asking me my opinion in the first place. And she would say, well, I just wanted to verify that I was right. There's one room in my house that looks like me. It's my office/study. And I only have one, it's not mahogany, it's walnut. I have one walnut library table where I spread out my stuff. And she said, there are nicer looking work tables than that. And I said, woman, leave me some dignity. But then, you see, she gave me the gift she had. And it was far more suitable for what we became than anything I could have imagined. My grace was not in arranging a house or running a house. My grace is to do what I do. Her grace is a superlative in that venue, as mine might be thought of as being more than the ordinary in what I do. I learned how to rule for the benefit of my wife by understanding one fundamental principle. And that principle is this: even as it applies to your wife, you should know no one any longer according to the flesh. You say, well, help me with that, how that principle works. I was not receiving my wife in the way God made her to function when He assembled her to me. I wasn't receiving her. I thought I had a better decorating idea. When she, as compared to me, she was a 10 and I was a -4. And I was frustrating her gift to the point of distraction. She was so distressed by my blocking her that she just decided to live in this schizophrenic arrangement that we call decoration. And when I backed off and gave it to her, what I essentially did was I recognized and I submitted to the Christ in her. By receiving the gift of Christ in her, and everything changed for me. I didn't get here by leaping tall buildings in a single bound. I got here by all these and hundreds more stories like these, whether it involved my children, my wife, spiritual sons, neighbors, you name it. In every situation, I had to learn what rule looked like. And the bottom line was ruling for the benefit of those who are under your rule. And the way that looks is it begins with recognizing who they are in the Spirit and receiving them as you would receive Christ in that. That's the only way to receive your wife. And if you ever hope to become one flesh, reminiscent of Christ and the church, you begin with receiving them in their gifts, knowing them no longer by the familiar and familiarity of their flesh, and creating the space for them to grow into. Retaking rule is the single greatest challenge in changing mindsets. From the culture of the orphan, who knows only that he or she is their only resource, to coming back to recognizing if you'll receive another the way God made them, then you're receiving the Christ in them, and God will provide the actual money to buy the new furniture that they want to give as a gift to you, expressing the Christ in them. You know, that's what happened to us. I marveled. We didn't sell the old stuff for much of anything, because that's not what God was using. That's not what God was after. He wanted to test me to see if I would receive Him in her, and that He would provide me the economy by which she would be supplied to be exactly who she was supposed to be. Amen? Now, this isn't about decorating and school functions and those things. It isn't about that. These are examples of the context in which I had to learn how to transition from the culture of the orphan to the culture of the son. Do you know that's what God means to do in what we call the house of God? This isn't about a collection of individuals. This is about an arrangement of a family under the rule of a father, containing containing fathers who might be cultured differently to represent God the Father. Now, I have much more to say, but we've already gone quite a bit tonight, and you probably have had as much as you can hold just now. So I'll wrap this piece up and set the stage up for the next things I want to talk about. In this continuing message, both of the culture of the orphan and how we retake and implement the culture of the son. And some of the aspects of why that we haven't touched on or finished out with as yet. Faith has been presented to us as deciding what you want and beseeching God in the most pious and persistent and even piteous ways to see if you could move him to your side of the ledger. Faith has been presented as that. Decide what's best for you, and then, please God, please God, please. And especially if I prime the pump with giving some money, then God is obligated to do what I ask. I can hardly think of the word I want to use to describe how pitiful that notion of faith is. It's not even in the ballpark. It's not even in the cricket grounds. Faith. The word in the Greek is the word pistis, P-I-S-T-I-S, pistis. Anytime you study a subject in the Greek, you would use the word logic associated with the root term, and you would be indicating that you're studying the thing in detail. So if, for example, you're studying the life in the body, which is the Greek term bios, then the study of the bios would be bios logos, or biology. If you're studying the soul, the word for soul is psyche. If you're studying the full ramifications of the psyche, what it is, how it functions, and so on, then you'd be studying psychologo, or psychology. If you're studying faith, and it seems as a contradiction in terms to talk about the logic of faith, because to hear them tell it, they're opposites. Faith is one thing, reason or logic is another. No, not if you think of it in terms of pistis, epistemology. The epistemology has in it the central word pistis, which is faith, and you're studying how faith works, then that's your epistemology. Whatever conclusions you come up with, from on which then you base your future actions, that's called your epistemology. You see, these big words shouldn't. The people of God have the spirit of understanding. And if you'll challenge them with the truth, they will always come up higher. So why are we dumbing it down? You just learned, if you didn't know it already, you just learned a very big word. And you know it, you know what it means, and you can use it. You've just learned about epistemology, which is what are the premises upon which you base your life's conclusions. What is important to you? What is it that you trust in? So much so that you base your decisions on those assumptions. That's your epistemology. And that's what faith is. when it says faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen, he's not defining faith. He's defining the environment of faith, because intrinsic to the word faith is the assumption of an epistemology. What are the elements of our epistemology? Well, they're defined in the same passage. Whoever comes to God must believe that he is. Assumption number one. Epistemological assumption number one. You must believe that God exists as your Father. Because if you look at the context, this is Hebrews. How does Hebrews begin? God is speaking in Son, who is the radiance of his Father's glory and the exact representation of his Father's being. He's defining the role of the Son and therefore placing himself in the role of Father. And 11 chapters later, when he says must believe that he is, it's not in the metaphysical conceit that perhaps God exists or doesn't exist. It is within the stated context of the epistle that says the Son is the radiance of the Father's glory and the exact representation of his Father's being. So it's inescapable that when the scriptures speak of faith, and the element of faith being, whoever comes to God must believe that he is, it's not talking about the existential proposition of whether or not God exists. It is talking about the way that subject matter is defined within the preceding context. And he's building it out to this thing where he says faith then is whoever comes to God must believe that he is, and then the other thing is he rewards those who diligently seek him. Now, so why does he use the sayings, faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen? Why does he insert that as the process by which your epistemology is put to the test? Do you believe that God actually exists as your Father? And do you believe that he will reward you with his presence when you diligently seek him? Because that's not a tangible reality in the present, but it is the attainable reality if you exercise the foundations of your epistemology. That's, guys, this is the spirit of understanding. You see? It ought to flow out of us like a river. We should be the brightest lights in the earth because we are the light of the world. I'm waging all-out war against the ignorance that dominates our minds and clouds us from the understanding of why we're actually here. In this war, I give no quarter to the enemy. So, what then is the substance of things hoped for? The evidence of things not seen. The word substance, hypostasis, Hypostasis. Hypostasis. It's really what the word means. If you look up substance, it's the word hypostasis. Hypo means under. Stasis is a state of being. So faith, presuming the epistemology of coming to God, accepting that he is your Father, and will reveal himself to you if you diligently seek him, you stand under that. You stand under that. Hupo, you come under. And the standing under is defined by a term that's involved with hypostasis. And it's the term tithemi. T-E-T-H-E-M-I. Tithemi. Tithemi means to lie down as if you're dead. To lie down as if you are dead. Now that is pretty, that's pretty vulnerable, if you ask me. God shows you something. Give your wife the reins to decorate the house, because otherwise you're not helping her become who I made her to be. And my objection, we can't afford this. It's what kept me in stasis for so long. We can't afford this. But when I chose to lie down in what God showed me as His way of liberating me from a very poor representation of who He is, I was in a state of tithemi. And in fact, I wanted to get back up out of the state of tithemi and go get the furniture back. I repented. I had a moment of wanting to change my mind, but I held to the course. So what did God do? There's another word that is associated with tithemi, and it's the word histemi. H-I-S-T-E-M-E. Histemi. We get the word histamine. Histamine from that. And pharmaceutical companies develop medicines that are called antihistamine. Well, when you lie down in an environment of allergens, as if you're dead, your body is vulnerable to the attacks. Vital organs are vulnerable to attack. So God has to histemi, stand up in you, in your circumstance. God has to stand up in you, in your circumstance. God has to, I'll say it again, because you may not believe me, but this is my story, this is my testimony, this is my journey. I didn't get here because of unbelief. I got here because I overcame the inherent culture of the orphan and the predisposition inherent in that culture to not believe. And I was born on a small island in the northern part of St. Vincent. Quite literally, I think, behind God's back, because that's what they used to say about people from Rose Hall. That's up there. That's further up that line, that's behind God's back. I understand what it means to come from these environs where you live in the assumption of lack. And that's the trap, that's the prison of the orphan. It's a prison of his own making. He cannot believe. When you do not have a father, and I did have a father, when you did not have a father, and you grew up like this one fellow told me one time, he said, I kept a tortilla under my pillow. And I said, was that when you lost a tooth? Is it, was that the tooth fairy leaving you a tortilla, flour, like a roti? He said, no. I kept it under my pillow so I'd have something to eat in the morning when I got up. Yeah. When you grow up in environments where you know people like that, and you yourself are surrounded by circumstances that are quite akin to that, breaking out of that mindset and believing that you're a son of God who, by implication, who has a father in heaven, who is unlimited in his creative power. So if he doesn't presently have it, he can make it when he needs to. And you are his son. This isn't about the hype of believing God. Believe God for what you want, give me some money, and that's the formula for you to get what you have determined your life is about. That's rubbish. But when and because God made sons, his intent originally was a man in the image and likeness of God. We'll talk more about image and likeness later. Not tonight. I'm done, with the exception of the last sip of tea. I'm going to draw it out until... No. When God intends to fill you with his presence so you may represent him, then at your disposal is all that is in creation, heaven and earth. And if that's not sufficient, what's at your disposal is all that is in the eternal. But if all we are interested in is getting enough from God, so we don't actually have to trust him, and we don't care about the relationship, we care only about the supply, then we need a massive mindset change, because God can't occupy that, nor will he. When you are in the condition of just plain obedience to God, it's as if you're dead. It feels like it. And I think in terms of providing for yourself, it is like that. And you would be dead as a doornail if God did not choose to stand up in your circumstance when he's the one who put you there. We got bigger problems than supply if God denies his own self in that circumstance. Yeah. Do you know this is exactly why the scriptures refer to that portion of the armor of God, and we're not at the point of implementing anything, I'm just hinting at how vast this subject matter is, how much it is that we don't know. Do you know when the scriptures refer to, and take to yourselves the shield of faith, wherewith you may be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked? Why would he call it the shield of faith? Faith. He could have called it the shield of motivation, but he called it the shield of faith, because your epistemology is your defense against the attacks of your enemy upon your identity. If you are the Son of God, he's always going to attack you on your identity. And God has given you an epistemology that will quench every question you're apt to have when you're in that condition of vulnerability. That's why it's called the shield of faith. The epistemology, the structure of the shield of faith is God exists as your Father. And God will reward you with his presence in the midst of your most ruckus storms. He will reward you with his presence. Why would he choose to reward you with his presence when what you're asking for is relief from the situation? Because his presence brings everything you need beyond what you could think or ask. The greatest thing God can ever give you is his presence. When he comes in, eternity migrates into your space and alters it irrevocably. Like when Jesus got into the boat with them, they'd been toiling all night against the wind and making no progress. He gets into the boat with them, and his economy comes into their space, and suddenly they're at the land where they were going. This is how it works. We have so much more to unpack, and I'll try to not keep you as long each time. But, when we are in the presence of God, it seems like time is suspended. It seems like we can't get enough. It seems like our understanding is opened, and with it, not only heaven, but eternity is open to us, and we cannot remain unchanged in these environments. We will behold him and become like him from glory to glory. That's what we're actually experiencing. You realize that I haven't done much to try to play on your emotions? And I hardly spoke a word to your soul. But I've been washing your spirit with the truth. And time went by like that. I commend you to God. This is how real this is. If you can't see this, then I don't know what else to say. And that's not a put down. That is to say, I am certain that your hearts burn within you when the scriptures are explained to you, like those two men on the road to Emmaus that afternoon of the resurrection of Jesus, and he explained the scriptures to them. And they said, when later they talked about it, they said, did not our hearts burn within us when he opened the scriptures to us on the way? Many people do not understand why I have so much influence upon some people. They don't understand because they're trying to understand with a carnal mind, and I am not a very good entertainer. Most of my jokes fall flat. In fact, you don't even recognize that I'm trying to joke about a certain matter. So no, it's not that. I have no real entertainment value. I'm not a particularly entertaining speaker or a particularly charismatic person. But I love the truth. I love the truth. I love the person of the truth. And that's the impact I have, because there are others like me who love the truth and can't get enough of it. So I commend you to God and to the word of his grace that is able to build you up and to establish you amongst the sanctified. We'll continue to prosecute this matter in the remaining sessions. God bless you.
Amen.